Hello. Okay, so today we're continuing with each of the planets and we're on the moon class. So let's talk a little bit about the psychology of the moon in the natives chart. And I have an entire book called the Shadow Side of the Mother's Love. And I know, Sarah Luna, I sent you your whole Aquarius. Abby, I don't know if you have the Aries chapter. I think you do. But there's pages of just qualities, psychological traits, talents, weaknesses linked to each moon. This is psychologically the most important placement in the chart, because at heart and in our psyche, we are perpetually children. So we're constantly trying to get our needs met through the lens of the moon, by sign and by house. So let's first look at a moment the psychology of the moon. The moon has every sign. Within a day or two, it's switching signs, and it changes phases every 8 days. So just as the phases change, just like the faces change, just like the signs are changing, that's how we behave in order to get our needs met in that house and in that sign in our chart. And I'll look at yours in a moment. So understand the volatility, the instability, the manipulative quality, the shadowy nature of this aspect of all of us. So from the psychological and subconscious perspective, this is our definition of love. It is not true. When we did Venus in Taurus, and then in a few weeks when we do the Venus via the Libra lens, that is our healthy or version of love that we want to display, not only with friendships, romance, but the moon sign is us having a temper tantrum, behaving like a child, trying to get our needs met under any face, under any condition, under anything that we have to do to manipulate to get our emotional hit. Love linked to the moon sign has to do with pain, not love the way that we think it. So it's something that we're constantly perpetuating because we thought that in the womb, which is where that moon matrix is developed, we're getting loved. So how does this impact psychologically? When we're in the womb, our mother is meeting, quote unquote, our needs. We're getting breath and we're getting food, basic. We're in a home. So our first home is the womb. We're having the basic necessities of quote unquote safety. It doesn't mean it's true, met, and we're getting fed. So it's the bare basic minimum. So the moon sign is what keeps us in a constant fight or flight state, just getting our basic necessities met. And we will do anything and everything to get that hit. The thing is that mom was living an emotional life while you were getting your basic necessities met in the womb. How she was living her emotional state, hormonally, tired, her water broke at work and she stressed out, she had bleeding and she rushed to the hospital, whatever it was, she was in a domestic violence situation. She was on bed rest. There was a hurricane outside. Any external circumstances is connected to your view of safety in the world. So I'll pick on Sarah Luna for a moment. Your moon's in Aquarius. Aquarius is an unstable moon. It has to do with the weather events. It has to do with hurricane, with tornado. So your safety is when you're running for cover. Your safety is linked to when you're creating chaos. Your safety or love is when you're kind of creating a chaotic experience in your life. It seems counterintuitive, but if your mom was living some sort of chaos, again, whether it was a weather event, because Aquarius moons can be running for shelter from an ancestral astrology perspective, it was a learned behavior. You hear lightning, you hear thunder, you hear you know, someone coming into the tribe, get out. You got real quick at picking up your stuff and running, escaping chaos out of the way. That's how you created safety from a fight or flight perspective. Where Abby's is in Aries, so it's more war, it's more like anger, it's more like attack, it's more aggressive, right? So that is tied in to love. I'm Cancer, and in the 8th, I am hiding out. I'm gonna find whatever home I can find under a rock or wherever. And Jen is planning every plan known to man with her Sagittarius moon. So that is the version of safety, fight or flight, love that we're conditioned to believe is love, but really is pain. And this is how we show up in our relationships. So we show up as children needing to get our needs met. So I have a little trick that I tell clients. Give yourself, meaning your inner child, the sign of your moon, and give everybody else the opposite. Okay, so that way you're reserved that fight or flight, that what I call the 20%, and then everybody else, 80%, gets the opposite sign. And it gives you some structure in how to utilize your moon so that it's not self-destructive, but it's more nurturing. And we are obviously entitled to be a victim, to be a child, to have a bad day, to seek safety and refuge and have others meet our needs a portion of the time. But it doesn't become the constant emotional hit that we're seeking. Okay, so let's talk about, let me bring up, I've got Abby's. So what we'll do is we'll do a few. Do I have yours, Sarah? It's not here. You'll have to give it to me again. July 21?
28th.
28?
Yeah.
What
And
time?
5:15 p.m. I believe. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go each house and then we'll go each sign and we'll do a little bit of the moon phase. And you have the videos on this, but we'll talk about that. And Jen, I have yours here. So first, let's talk about the mythology. There's many, many, many myths of the moon. Okay, so one of the ones I shared in your lecture materials is that of Artemis and Apollo. So Artemis and Apollo, the moon and the sun. And Artemis is birth first. And within seconds of giving birth, her mom asks her to be the midwife to help her birth her son, her brother, the Apollo, the sun in our chart. So the moon and the sun in the chart are luminaries. And they're the two spots that represent the opposites, the tension of opposites, like Jung called it, the light and the dark, the shadow and the light. So we have to look at both of these in relationship, but today we're just going to focus on the moon. Remember that the moon in the sky has no light of its own. So it's only what you get from another that you feel as if your moon is satisfied. So that's the dynamic of the house of your moon. You're going to do what you have to so that another gives you validation. So another meets your needs. And there's 4 unmet needs: safety, security, protection, validation, and love. And so that's the function of the moon at a subconscious, unhealthy level. We really want to learn to love from our Venus, but this is obviously part of our psychology. The moon is what I call the matrix in which we view the world. You can never remove the veil of your moon from your psyche, ever. And so every situation you go in with the moon sign and by the moon house. And that's your lens and your perspective to the world. So when Artemis has to birth her brother, the sun, or Apollo, that is in part what we're trying to do. Part of the individuation process, part of the growth process, part of the process of self-love and self-worth is that through our moon sign and relinquishing some of that power, we allow the sun to emerge. We allow our true light, our true shining, our ego, our personality, our divine will, all of the things that the sun represents to emerge. But most people spend their life living life and seeking everything through their moon lens. That's how important in the chart the moon is. And we're all enamored by the moon, but it's actually a shadow aspect of ourselves. So that's one aspect of the mythology, is this idea that the shadow has to be looked at, the shadow has to be birthed, the shadow has to be surrendered to before the sun can emerge. And so it's through the moon or the shadow aspects, this darkness within and our desire to get others to meet our needs and love us unconditionally and not, that we allow our essence to emerge. So that's where these two luminaries work together. Another aspect of the myth of the moon is that she was a huntress. She was a virgin goddess. And the virgin goddesses, what they mean symbolically is that we don't allow ourselves to grow up. If you're giving the love through the moon sign or the moon house, you're acting as a child. The virgin goddess doesn't ever leave their mother's side. The virgin goddess never has sex, metaphorically, to become a woman, to become an adult. And so we see a lot of illnesses, we see a lot of problems with people having trouble with fertility, with losing custody, with death of a child, to honor the moon in the chart. It's very loaded, and that book talks much more about that. But we have like this unnatural loyalty to this idea of the virgin goddesses in mythology. And so Aphrodite, who's Venus, is obviously not a virgin goddess. So we're talking about Artemis, we're talking about Hecate, we're talking about Hestia, all of these goddesses, Athena, they all commit to their parents rather than living their own life. And eventually, it is only through our Venus sign that we can love ourselves fully, and we can love others truthfully in a romantic relationship, in an adult transaction. All transactions with the moon are childlike. None of them are adult. And there's times and appropriateness for that, but most of the time it's not, other than obviously being a child. The moon also has to do with how we seek our needs and what lengths we'll go to manipulate, depending on the house and by sign, in order to get those needs met. Depending on the element, depending on the sign, there's going to be links to addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, shopping, food, because it is what we consider what I call the toxic waters of the womb. Whatever mom was experiencing during pregnancy is tied into that moon sign and that moon house. And that's what your psyche deems to be stable, to be safe, to be the first home, to be rooted, even if it's not rooted, if it's an unrooted sign like Aquarius and Sagittarius. Okay. Any questions on the psychology or the mythology? Okay. So let's start with the houses. The moon in the first house. A person that has the moon in the first house is very, very unstable. Their entire view of self, their entire identity is linked to what other people say, what other people think of them. So if they're going to change their identity as the moon shines on them, or as the phase of the moon, or as the light of the moon given to by another, then you never really know what you're getting with someone that has the moon in the first house. This is very different than the black moon. Both Abby and I have the black moon in the first, and we'll talk about that in Scorpio when we do Pluto. But the white moon is the one I'm talking about over here. Is going to have to do with your identity. So these people tend to have very low self-worth, and they tend to change like the phases of the moon depending on who's asking, who's telling, who's in the room, and what they want the person to view them as. So it's a very unstable placement. The moon in the second is going to be linked to your value system and your spending habits. So spending habits are going to be very emotional in nature. So that's sort of the larger umbrella. That could also be food, necessity to spend money on food, on traditions, on memories, on family things, on gifts for mom, things that have to do with the home, that have to do with the family, that have to do with traditions, that have to do with memories. But they're emotional attachments and they're emotional purchases. So this is a tricky combo right here. Neptune, Moon, Uranus. All three of these are linked to instability in terms of spending, and they have to do with instability in self-worth. The moon in the second, you cannot change your self-worth or your value system depending on the phase of the moon. So really having a very solid value statement or a value system is going to be very important. Neptune by default in the second, and we'll cover that more when we do Neptune, is a tendency to have a unclear or nebulous identity. And then Uranus has a tendency to not necessarily have roots, but rather create or try to reinvent an identity or a value system or a self-worth. And so if there isn't anything in that second house anchoring, and it's in an Aquarius, it's in a sign that's not rooted, that's going to be a really important placement in order to anchor your identity and your value, your self-worth, and how you spend your money. The moon in the third is going to be swayed emotions with your thoughts. Every thought that enters, everything that comes your way, you're going to follow every thought. You know, we have that idea of people who meditate and they see the thought and they let it go, and they see the thought and let it go. A moon in the third is following every thought to everywhere. They can't kind of settle into the groundedness of any thought, because the moon just kind of has them sort of going wherever it takes them. The third has to do with the thoughts. It also has to do with kindergarten through 12th grade. It also has to do with neighbors, with cousins. It has multiple meanings, but I'm talking just sort of how the moon and the emotions are dictating the person's worth and the person's identity in the house that it's in. The moon's natural placement is in the fourth, and it likes to be there because it's at home. But the problem with the moon in the fourth is it's very difficult for this person to get out of a low level consciousness. The moon has to do, in the story of Jesus, when Jesus is born into the manger, the moon has to do with the metaphor of us being born in a manger, an animal manger, an animal consciousness. The moon is our family of origin. Therefore, if we reject our moon, or we don't do shadow work to look at our moon, then we really truly don't ever know ourselves and our shadow aspects. And we think that our family of origin is different, or we think that we're better than them, or we try to move away from them, which is part of the journey. The people with moon in the fourth have difficulty with that. They have difficulty moving away from that family of origin. Doesn't mean that they don't judge it, and it doesn't mean that they can't see that the vibration is low and there's an animal consciousness there, but they may never be able to get out of the family of origin. So in the Bible story of the prodigal son, one leaves, the prodigal son leaves, the other one stays. The moon in the fourth is typical of the child that stays and never goes on his or her own journey. Moon in the fifth. So the fifth being the house of children and the moon being in the fifth, you would think that this would be a person that has multiple children, just like Jupiter in the fifth. But actually, Jupiter and moon in the fifth, oftentimes, because it's the virgin goddess, the childlike nature, will oftentimes refuse to have a child, or they want to stay the eternal child. So if they do happen to have children, someone with a moon in the fifth, oftentimes they're the child and the child is the adult. You see that inverse relationship in that part of the chart, or they don't want children at all because they don't ever want to have not be the child. Similar to your Jupiter in the fifth. Jupiter was dethroned. He doesn't want to be dethroned. It's not uncommon that Jupiter, like a moon in the fifth, doesn't want to be dethroned and they stay the eternal child. From a Jungian archetype, the moon in the fifth is something that we call the pure Eternus or the Puella Eternus. The pure or the Puella archetype is the Peter Pan, is the one that never wants to grow up. It's not uncommon with a moon in the fifth. And so that person might not grow up, they may not sexually develop, they may be a bit asexual, they might be very creative and such, but they don't see adulting as a goal in life. They're not really living in an adult type of world because they want to remain the eternal child. Moon in the sixth. So the sixth house being day-to-day, your routine, these people have mood swings. They could be maybe not satisfied as in terms of the day-to-day, or you never know how they're going to wake up in the day. They could be on the good side and the bad side. They're kind of just like emotionally, the emotions dictate their day-to-day. They don't have like a structure or stable emotional structure. Someone who is preoccupied with food, someone who's preoccupied with their diet, perhaps with memories, with tradition, with children, or that work in an environment around children is very typical with the moon in the sixth. The moon in the seventh, the moon likes to be in the seventh because it's a romance house, it's a friend's house. The problem is that in relationships, they can be the eternal child or they can attract a partner that's the eternal child. And so you see this relationship of parent-child rather than lover-lover. So you see a similar pure Eternus or Puella Eternus where you may attract a childlike person as a partner. The moon in the seventh allows people to be very sensitive or compassionate or open or loving to people receptively, but there's a tendency to passive-aggressive nature. The moon is passive-aggressive, the moon is codependent, the moon is manipulative. So you have it in your seventh, you might put on the mask, you might, lure the partner in, but then it's kind of like that passive-aggressive, having expectations to have your needs met and you stay the child. So you can attract that as your shadow, or that could be you in the relationship. Moon in the eighth. So moon in the eighth is a tough placement because if the moon is one of the luminaries and it's already a shadow aspect and it's in a shadow house, there's a very strong shadow aspect to the person. They might hide their emotional nature very, very profoundly, or they just be of a very, very deep emotional nature. From a child perspective, because the moon is linked to the mother and the child, there could be death of a child. There could be an ancestral lineage of dead children, depending on the sign. We'll look at that in a minute. And it could be someone who's also very psychic. So Cancer being one of the most psychic signs, all of the water in a water house. It could be a very, very psychic placement, someone who's very clairsentient, or someone who's very empathic. The moon in the 9th, that person should live abroad. The moon in the 9th, just like the sun in the 9th, are people that do best living abroad. These are teachers, these could be gurus, these could be philosophers. These are people that perhaps on unconventional lives, and they're kind of just, constantly seeking. It's the seeker archetype. The shadow of the seeker archetype is actually the caregiver, and the moon is a caregiver archetype. So it's an interesting relationship when the moon, which is the caregiver, is in the seeker house. The person is constantly seeking, maybe on their travels, maybe in their teaching, maybe in their job, maybe in their relationship. They can be the caretaker, but there's a constant need for escapism or seeking with the moon in the 9th. That's why living abroad is oftentimes a way to reconcile. In some astrological philosophies, the 9th house has to do with your second marriage. The way that I teach it, it's linked to the 11th house. So this is your first marriage, and it has nothing to do with paper. It has to do with children. So the person who gave you your first child or a child is found in the 7th. No papers, signatures needed. In many schools, the 9th house is considered the second marriage. That's anybody after the person who gave you your first child. So oftentimes, if the moon is the 9th, one of the guidance is to marry someone from another country. Someone international is not uncommon with the moon in the 9th. The moon in the 10th. The moon in the 10th is, it's needing to be on mass display. So these are people that might be in mass communications. They might have a platform. The moon is also the masses. It's the mass consciousness. So anything that we see in society that's like the sheep, the idea of sheeple, the idea of being shepherded to the mass consciousness, the low level consciousness, is where you have your moon. You have that tendency. If you have the moon in the 10th, you're going to have that. Perhaps you're the leader of the sheep because it's the 10th house where it's your public image and you're the one on stage. But you need a mass audience, or you want to be on mass display, or you want to herd the sheep or lead the sheep. So it's one of those placements that you could be the ruler of the masses, but that's another word for the moon, is the mass consciousness, sheeple, herd, people that don't have an identity of their own. Just think of all of the consciousness around the moon, that it has no light of its own. So these people, wherever you have the moon in your chart, you have those characteristics. So it's an area that you're easily swayed. It's an area where you may not identify that you're projecting that onto others when it's really you. The moon in 11th, the moon in the 11th is actually a really nice placement because it's the group house. So to have sort of a group consciousness in a group house is a nice placement. And if you have it in a good sign, then that's a really good placement. The sun and the moon in the 11th are actually two really good placements for the luminaries, because the group takes care of the individual. Now, this might keep the person from growing up, but there's a sense of the collective being responsible. And so there's a desire for the collective to be participatory. It's not an isolation feeling. And the moon, of course, likes to be, get light from all aspects. The moon in the 12th psychologically is a mother or the feminine that feels absent. So it's having like the feminine or the mother not physically present or feeling as if she was absent, maybe somewhere else, or was always working, or was worried about her own psyche and her own things, and wasn't the native doesn't feel as if mom or the feminine principle was present. It could be that that person feels that they mothered their mother. And that's not an uncommon feeling for where you have the moon, because remember, back to the Virgin goddess. Probably one massive exception is the moon in Libra, just because Libra is ruled by Aphrodite. Not to say that the moon in Libra doesn't mean that they didn't feel like they were a child, but they naturally are seeking relationship. They're naturally seeking partnership by virtue. That's why the moon in Libra hops from boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, over and over and over again, because they're constantly seeking marriage or relationship and partnership. They're not really looking for mom and dad, the entity of mom and dad. They're looking for mom and dad in the partner. That's the one exception. All of the moons are linked to a virgin goddess in some way, but that, because it's Aphrodite, would be the, if there's an exception to the rule. Any questions on the houses? And we'll go through each of yours. So Abby, where's yours? So Abby's is also in the second. Okay, so now yours is really touching the cusp. So it's when any time, especially a luminary, but anytime there's any planet that's touching the cusp, it's as if the energy of that planet is in that houses as well as the other house. So it's like sharing the second and the third. So whether it's your identity, your value system, the way you spend your money, and or your thoughts, there, or your siblings, your neighbors, your home, what you view as a neighborhood, there's going to be a shared energy there, because it's right there on the cusp. So anytime, so you have Uranus on the cusp, you've got Pluto on the cusp, so you're going to see this theme repeated. You have Saturn on the cusp. So there's always this feeling of being on the cusp of something, or like on the brink of an edge, you know, that kind of psychology in your chart. You see that repeated over and over. So you start to see those themes. So just because we're talking about the moon today, because it's on the cusp, you're sharing that energy between those two houses.
Yeah, it's interesting because on a lot of the other programs that I've used, like CoStar and things, it's actually the third house is what it comes up as.
Okay, it
I was just
might
going to
be
say that. I was just noticing that too. I was like, I thought Abby's moon was in the third house. But
Yeah,
then,
because I'm pretty sure time passages, it's also in the third house.
yeah.
and it might be that they use equal houses. I don't know. I don't have CoStar, so I don't know what they use. But yeah, when it's on the cusp like that, especially if you're using different house systems, that kind of stuff is not uncommon. And Jen's, yours is right on the cusp too of the 11th. So it's like being in the 11th and being in the 12th. So the community, the collective that we're talking about, in terms of herding, right? You know, herding the groups, and and you're constantly talking about your community and your center, and if we're invited, who's invited onto the island, you know? So it's that kind of thing. So that moon has that energy. And I don't know if you guys know this about the moon is pretty cutthroat. The moon is not easy. In the myth of Artemis, Artemis being a virgin goddess, she had a follower named Calypso. And Calypso was lured by Zeus. Zeus shapeshifted into Artemis and tricked Calypso into having sex. And Calypso was confused because they were a virgin cult. And all over Greece, there were, you know, cults and worship to all these virgin goddesses and whatnot. And Calypso has sex in a hot tub with Zeus, thinking it's Artemis. And all of a sudden, Artemis and all her followers smell the scent of sex, and they kick her out of the cult. And the gods take pity. The gods always take pity, and they end up putting everybody in the sky. So Calypso's pregnant, and that becomes Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. And the bear, the totem of the bear is linked to this. And the bear has to do with the first truth of spiritual path, which is the truth of thoughts. And so the moon is linked to the shadow, is linked to the bear hibernates, the bear's in a cave. So we start to see how all of these themes and all of these symbols and all these stories and myths are interwoven. And there's this desire for purity, there's this desire for virginal, there's this desire for being pristine and intact. But the moon isn't like that. The moon shapeshifts and conforms to whatever it's given. So it's really interesting in our psyche that we're so drawn to this aspect, and this is how we view our world without realizing that it's just a projection of our own shadow, of our own passive aggressiveness, of our own darkness. So it's interesting when you start viewing the chart from the moon versus from the sun, or even the more high vibration anima, which is the Venus. So we'll as we do all of the archetypes, we'll kind of talk more about that. But the moon is definitely a trick. And let me do Nicole. She had to teach. And so Nicole's is in the 6th. So we talked about the mood, working day to day, not knowing what the day brings, perhaps not much of a stable routine, because it's kind of emphasis on food and diet. So all of these things with the moon. Any questions about the moon through the houses? And now we'll go through the signs. Okay, so we'll start with Abby, who has the moon in Aries. So the moon in Aries, what was understood in the womb is that life is a battle, life is war, life is competition, life is anger, life is aggression. So the way that love, for instance, is tackled is that way. And obviously, if you're tackling your romantic or love relationships that way, there's going to be some pain associated. And we all have pain associated with our moon. Try to identify in your particular life, in your particular moon sign, what emotion. Aries is more of an anger, of a wrath, of a rage. That's going to be a pretty common one. But what emotion is triggered by your moon sign repeatedly? That's going to be the emotion that you link to love. That's going to be the emotion that you seek experiences, however unhealthy, to be reminded that you deserve to have your needs met. Again, food and breath from the womb, and that somebody exists to create safety, a home, and meet your needs. That's why we consistently repeat the emotion that's attached to our moon sign. Is the emotion the one limiting belief? It is absolutely linked, yes. So the thought, the emotion, and the desire are repeatedly, and you'll see that in the first. If this is your birth story, for instance, your ascendant, right off, you start to see how our limiting beliefs are established, our desires, which is our second house, and then our emotions are all sort of packaged. So what tends to happen, and people don't seem to realize this, we all have a limiting belief, okay? So I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, I'm abandoned, I'm rejected, I'm ugly, I'm not rich enough, I'm not smart enough, whatever it is that you need the validation from. That thought must be accompanied with the desire that's attached to the body. Your emotion is attached to your body as well. So every time you start off a trigger of I'm not enough, There is an emotional response and a desire. The emotion is how you are trying to purify having had that thought, having had the desire, well, I'm better than, or I should be more, or that person is less than me, or I should have what they have. So the emotion, think of the water element, is how in our psyche we try to purify being impure. That's why it's the emotion that constantly kicks in. Mine was hopelessness. So as soon as I identified hopelessness, I can identify the thought, I'm rejected, I'm not enough. I put myself in exile, and my moon's in the 8th, which is the exile house. So it triggers, it sets off an entire sort of avalanche of thought, emotion, and desire on repeat, on repeat, on repeat. And that's your child mode. And you'll never grow out of that. So what we have to do is we have to put some limits on it. That's why I say give yourself that sign, and everybody else, in Abby's case, the Libra. So it's linked to, again, aggression, anger, rage. So Jen, I don't know if you necessarily remember what was happening during the womb experience. It's how the child understood mom's external environment to be. From an ancestral perspective, and we won't go into ancestry until level 4, but from an ancestral perspective, this is the type of person who sleeps with one eye open. They're going to invade the shanty town that I live in. They're going to invade the tribe. They're going to invade, and I've got to pick up my stuff and get the hell out, quick, out, save my life, fight or flight. So you're in constant, this is the Amazonian moon. You're in constant mode, shoot the arrow, get out, find safety. So there's this constant, seeking that sort of energetic, and it's a lot of energy, it's a lot of charge. And then you obviously have to have a rest period. And it's an exhausting moon. It's one of the exhausting moons. I think the fire and the air moons are the worst in terms of energy expenditure, because they're constantly trying to flee. If the moon is the emotion, if the moon is safety, if the moon is your first home, if the moon is roots, if the moon is supposed to be you getting some respite of someone meeting your needs, but fire and air is always moving, going, escaping, getting away, what respite do you get? So the water and the earth moons, even though they're harder to change, the psychology of the earth moons are the worst. The earth moons take forever. The Taurus moon is the slowest moon to make a change. Those people feel that death, I think that's the sentence I put in the book, change equals death. They can't move at a turtle's pace, but they create the pretty home, they create the roots, they might have land, they might invite the family over, because they're trying to recreate sort of that womb beautification. It's ruled by Venus. But in terms of changing, of growing up, of becoming an adult, oh my God, lifelong journey. So the earth and water moons have the psychological difficulty of moving out of the family, kind of like that prodigal son metaphor. They're constantly in the manger, seeking the family, always wanting that low consciousness or the masses or part of the herd. But the fire and air moons are constantly trying to escape, not be caught, not be, trapped, an escape plan, a plan B. And so it's like, which is better psychologically, either one wear and tear on you. So the Taurus moon is indeed the slowest moon to change. These people want food and flowers and nice conversation and incense and all things beauty, and they can't get out of their own way for their life. It is one of the hardest, I think it's of the moons, it's the hardest moon to change. The moon in Gemini. The moon in Gemini, the one word to define the moon in Gemini is options. The moon in Gemini cannot have one path. 2 boyfriends, 2 girlfriends, 2 schools, 2 lovers, 2 teachers, 2 houses, 2 books, 2, or more. The word beside options is dispersed. So think of the psychology of the emotions. They're constantly being dispersed, then no one can ever own me. No one can ever brand me. No one can ever really be connected to me, because all I'm thinking about is how am I going to disperse? And that's a thing with all of the air moons, fire too. Fire are constantly grasping for more and more and more. Air moons are always disperse, disperse, disperse. Now, from an ancestral point of view, this makes sense. Because if you have to leave all your stuff and you can only take one thing, it makes sense that you need to be dispersed and you're not attached to those things. But in Luna's chart, for instance, with the moon in Aquarius in the second, are you constantly dispersing? Are you constantly giving away? Are you giving yourself no value, your energy, your love, your emotions? Because it's constantly dispersed. I have to create so much chaos, so I'm never caught. So the moon is an ancestral mind game because we're not that anymore. It helped our ancestors get us here, but it's hurting us now. And every moon rules a body part. Abby's is the head, Taurus is the thyroid and the skin, Gemini is the lungs, Cancer is the breasts, Leo is the heart, Virgo is the intestines, Libra is the kidneys, Aries and Libra share adrenals, Scorpio is the reproductive organs, Sagittarius is the hips and the sexual organs as well. Where am I? Capricorn is the structure, the bone structure of the body. Aquarius is the nervous system, and Pisces is the feet and mental health. So if you're not healthily emotionally, that part of your chart becomes a weak spot. That can be a space for illness so that you can embody and start learning to meet your own needs. So nowhere on my chart would I have breast cancer. Genetically, biologically, nothing, but I have a moon in Cancer. And so my weak organ was my breasts. So there's many ways to see, for instance, illness, but the moon is one of those. Cancer. Cancer is all water moons. All water moons want their minds read. Okay, all of us. Scorpio is the worst. The moon in Cancer wants to be the person who never leaves the womb, ever. They're attached to the hip, to their mother 24/7. It is the quintessential virgin goddess. It is Artemis. So the moon in Aries is Artemis as the huntress. And what happens in one of the aspects of the myth of Artemis is that accidentally she kills her lover, Orion. And so in the hunt, she kills her love. And there you see a lot of the anger and the aggression in the relationship is living out that myth. In the moon, it's I need to meet my mother's needs. I have to help my mother birth herself. That was my story. I couldn't have any identity until I helped my mother have her own type of thing. And it was always her and always her. So a moon in Cancer is extremely enmeshed with the parents. It's the eternal child that never wants to grow up. The moon in Leo. The moon in Leo is, it's funny because you think of Leo as narcissistic and charismatic and center of attention, but a very, very, very small group of people. Moon in Leo people are very scared of big groups because the psychology of the moon in Leo, there's two. In the story, there are strong women. There's a strong women lineage in a moon in Leo. Immediately, you see a moon in Leo, there's a lineage of strong women. They like them, they hate them, it doesn't matter. Women are strong in that lineage. And they were told stories, not only of women, but of people that had almost superhuman qualities. They were superheroes. Oh, your great grandfather fought in the war and blah, 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 blah. Then the psychology of the person with the moon in Leo, because they have that strong lineage and a superhero sort of mindset of someone in the family, is falling from grace. So they tend to keep very small groups of friends because they want the fall to be very small. They're very, very afraid of being dethroned. So you'll see, rather than thinking that they would be, socially apt and it doesn't mean that they're not charismatic and stuff, but they actually play safe and keep it small with people that they know that they could be perhaps the best or the king of their jungle. They're not going to explore into larger areas for the most part because of the psychology of afraid from falling from grace. The moon in Virgo. The moon in Virgo is a person who most likely had to grow up very quickly, or the only time that they got to be imperfect. The word for Virgo moon is perfection, 100% of the time. The only time they were not allowed to be perfect was when they were sick. So you'll see them attracted to the medical industry. They're natural caretakers. When they're sick, they'll, let themselves off the hook. If not, it's perfection seeking, and perfection seeking breeds illness. So it's a vicious cycle. The judgment, the criticism, the OCD. That moon is people who are like and this is for Earth, not Taurus Earth, but Capricorn moon and Virgo moons. The Earth moons, that they appear to be older than they are, like an old soul type of thing. They had to like take care of the family, or they were the oldest sibling. It's the Cinderella moon. So you tend to see that self-deprecation, or putting others first, or I don't matter, or I'll sleep on the floor, my needs don't matter. And of course, it's passive aggressive, but that's the way they attempt to get their needs met. Moon in Libra. The word for the moon in Libra is it's complicated. Honesty is complicated. That moon is about people pleasing at all lengths. Doesn't matter who. They tend to be in relationship to relationship to relationship, and honesty is complicated. They will make what you need to be honesty, that is what they will show up as. It's the hostess with the mostest moon. The moon in Scorpio, of the water moons, it's the hardest water moon to be in relationship with, because all water moons want to be have their minds read, but the moon in Scorpio, the minute they tell you, it's an interesting relationship, that womb. The minute they tell you what they need, they already fall out of love with you, because they're like, you should have known. So it's like, you can't tell your partner they should know, and you can see the relationship, because the psychology of the moon in Scorpio is my mother knew. My mother knew before I even asked. My mother knew exactly what I needed. When I was cold, when I was hungry, when I was wet. You should too, if you love me. That's when you start to see the psychology of, if you love me, or I'm a child, or read my mind, or meet my needs. And this is how most relationships are being held, from a moon to moon perspective. That's why we're in such a shit show, as it's a child being in relationship with child. It's very different when it's Mars and Venus. The moon in Sagittarius is the least depth moon. It is the the moon that wants least depth. Don't tell me, all's great, let me shove it down, lock it in 3 boxes, don't need to look at that. Let's just go on to the next thing. Where's the next party? The moon in Aquarius is what I call the jellyfish moon. Yes, 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 I want you. No, I don't. Yes, 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 I want you. No, I don't. Yes, 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 I want you. No, I don't. but they don't want me. Nope. You get real close and you convince them that you want them, and then you're like, nope, too close for comfort. Someone's coming to my tribe. I gotta pack my stuff and get out to the next one. And then the moon in Pisces. Oh goodness, the moon in Pisces. The problem with the moon in Pisces, first of all, addiction, codependence. What isn't wrong with the moon in Pisces? The problem with the moon in Pisces is the psychology of the person. With the moon in Pisces, they think that their mother is the universal mother. So this morning I was teaching a class on emotions and illusions. The number one space in your chart where you have illusion, where you have delusion, where you hide your impure thoughts or your non-virginal purity is in your moon. And so you trigger an emotional response to purify yourself and be all childlike, because you convince yourself in your psychology that your mother is God. But as you go through your spiritual journey and certain transits, namely Uranus, Pluto, crack that open, and you start to realize, oh shit, my mother is human, my mother is flawed, my mother didn't meet my needs, I wasn't loved unconditionally as a child, and all those realities start to surface, you start to seek those things within, and you start to decipher mom from God. And you realize that there's a great mother, that there's a universal mother, that there's a universal womb, that there's a universal consciousness, and that your earthly mother is simply human and flawed. The moon in Pisces has much difficulty in this because they convince themselves that their earthly mother is the divine mother. Imagine that mind game. Yes, so I'll go back, the moon in Scorpio. So all water moons, so let's talk a little bit about needs. Earth is mainly safety, security. If you have an earth moon, you want safety, security needs. Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn. Did I skip Capricorn? I skipped Capricorn, didn't I? Moon in Capricorn is cold. The mother was either working all the time, very cold. They were raised maybe by grandparents. I remember doing a meditation on the moon in Capricorn, and the meditation was close your eyes and imagine a baby in like a onesie in this cabin in the middle of the woods where it's winter. There's a stale piece of bread and a candle that's barely lit. That is the emotional nature of a moon in Capricorn. Everything's cold and dry and no emotion and no food and no warmth and nothing. And they rely on themselves, a very resilient moon, to meet their own needs, right? Because it's like, I can stay warm, I can feed myself, I don't need anybody. And you can see the difficulty of that psychologically. So the earth moons are linked to safety and security. That's the main psychology. And they will do whatever it takes. That's why the moon in Taurus is the hardest one to change. Hell no, am I changing? Safety and security is my middle name, and nothing, not the smallest little change will I make, because this works for me. This is what I know. They'll dress up, so to speak, the home with flowers, like I said, and perfumes and you know, biscuits and stuff, but they want what they know and they want no change. So that's the psychology of the earth moons. The psychology of the water moons is protection. Protect me, protect me, protect me at all cost. Protection comes from the psychology of being in the womb. So all water moons don't want to ask for what they need. You should read my mind. If you love me, you would know. But the Scorpio moon in particular, if they actually have to ask, that's it. It's like the love fades. You should know, I shouldn't have to ask. The moon in Cancer is more about, I'm going to meet my mother's needs, and eventually I'll get some crumb on the floor. And the moon in Pisces is like, my mother is God incarnate. She can do no wrong. I'm golden. I got mom. Like, mom's my mom. Like, that's like Jesus having God as the father. But the Scorpio moon is, the minute I have to ask, the minute I have to clarify, we're screwed. You should know. That's the hardest one for that reason, emotionally. The moon in Pisces, to be in relationship with a moon in Pisces, especially if you're just as emotionally unstable, oh my God, you guys feed off one another. It's a codependent, it's a merging, it's, we're in a spiritual ecstasy of tantra all day long nonsense. But that's why you can handle a moon in Pisces romantically. But a moon in Scorpio is tough, because how do you get it right all the time? How does the other person never give you a hint to what they need? Make sense? The moon in Air, they want validation. Validation, validation, validation. It's constant. And the moon in Fire wants love. Their version of love, and you should know what that is. If you know me, you know exactly what I need and how to love me the way I need to be loved. But it's a constant seeking for love. Any questions? So we did, Jen, you have the Sag. So we talked about that. So in that aspect of your chart, now we're eventually in level 2 going to look at the relationship, obviously, with the moon and other planets. So this is just a piecemeal of an isolated moon in the sign in the house. So you can start putting, home, emotions, mother, child, unmet needs, inner child, safety needs, food, emotional intelligence, all the words of memory, traditions, all of that, plus your house, and then plus the sign. So you could start to see your particular relationship of moon in your chart. And then eventually we're going to see what aspects there are, because that's going to either enhance the moon and how it works in your life, or make it more of a detriment to you. And then let me look at Nicole's. Oh, and Nicole has the Pisces. So we talked about that already in terms of not only relationship, but look, Nicole's somebody who does these retreats, and I don't know if she does ayahuasca or what medicine, but these medicines that are often considered mother medicines. So it makes sense. And in her work life, part of that is to hold the space as universal mother as people enter the cosmic consciousness or the universal womb. So again, there's many aspects to the moon, but psychologically, it's what keeps you infantile. It's what keeps you seeking other people to meet your needs. It's what keeps you a covert, tricky, manipulative, passive aggressive. So at a low consciousness, that's what the moon means psychologically. And that's the way that you want to look at it, because it's going to taint the way you view absolutely every other archetype. So it's the caregiver archetype, and it's not genuine caregiver archetype. It's the archetype of the caregiver, because if I meet your needs, then you're going to meet mine. So if your moon, in Nicole's case, is in Pisces, she gives herself the moon in Pisces and gives everybody else the moon in Virgo. Jen has the moon in Sag for herself. Everybody else gets the moon in Gemini. And that's actually not, you have to look at personally for each person. So I'm just going to kind of pick on Jen for a second. Jen has this huge stellium. This is a lot of energy in the emphasis of community and others. It is not a bad idea to disperse that energy and give people a moon in Gemini. Perhaps some guidance, perhaps some advice, perhaps, a trite conversation, but to disperse some of this concentrated energy on the community or the people or the tribe. So it's also a mechanism for you to conserve your own energy and meet your own needs while other people are getting you. So it's obviously case specific. Abby's is in Aries, so give everybody else Libra. And Sarah Luna, yours is in Aquarius, so give everybody else Leo. This just is so that you could give yourself sort of that permission to be your own child, nurture your inner child, give your child what it needs, and then other people can get an aspect of you, but it's not constantly you trying to get those people to meet your needs. Any questions on that? I want to spend a little time on the moon phases.
Just out of curiosity, just to clarify, what do you mean when you say like I'm an Aquarius but should present as Leo, or do I naturally present as a Leo moon, or?
No, that's something from my inner child slumber party class.
Okay.
If your moon keeps you in child, really the only child that you are here to nurture is your inner child, with the exception, spiritual law, between the ages of 0 and 14, as a parent, you are responsible for your child. So that's the only exception to that rule. So when my children were 0 to 14, moon in Cancer for myself, for them. Now they're older, moon in Cancer for me. Everybody else, moon in Capricorn. So you don't have children. So you're the only child that you're responsible for is Sarah Luna, your inner child. Give her the moon in Aquarius qualities. Give everybody else the opposite sign. So it keeps you, part of the inner child psychology is every time you judge another person, you're judging your inner child. You're telling your inner child that she is not enough because you're judging another. Really, there is no other, so you're judging her. So if you meet her needs every time you're chaotic, every time you're rebellious, if you uproot, if you overspend on frivolous things, whatever it is that your moon in Aquarius causes you to do, it's for her. It's fine. I tell clients 20% of the time, you can't be in that child all the time. But if you normalize your moon sign for yourself, now you've developed a relationship with your inner child that says, I meet your needs only, you meet my needs. This is a special relationship between you and your divinity. Everybody else gets a different version. But if you're giving everybody the moon in Aquarius so that they could constantly meet your needs, your inner child is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and sitting in a corner, and she's getting no special attention. That's where I got that from. Okay, so it's just it's an easy technique to kind of say, oh, others and me. Make sense? So there are 8 moon phases. We're just going to look. If you have this, I'm just going to show you how to get it. Okay. You're going to go to rectify. No, mentira. You're going to go to reports. And you were born in a full moon, Sarah Luna. So the full moon phase, there's 8 phases. It's right there. And you can Google the day of your birth and your moon phase. And in that book, and in your videos also, there's more information on your moon phase. Your moon phase is how far along in this particular lifetime you are with the set of souls that you're incarnating with. So you're midway. Of 8, you're at 4. Okay, so every 8 lifetimes, we incarnate with the same group of people, and we'll look at the nodes as well. So if out of the 8 phases, for instance, I'm in the 3rd phase, okay? So it has to do with part of your personality. You're in new moon phase, you tend to have new beginnings, you're trying to find yourself, your identity is a big question. As you move and progress through the phases of the moon, you start to develop more light of your own. The full moon is interesting because you're getting all of the light of the sun onto the moon. And so you're sort of midway in the journey of figuring out light and dark, myself versus others. And again, I go through each of the phases in the.
So just out of curiosity, because I was born on a lunar eclipse, but it's a full moon, wouldn't that be kind of like if the light?
All lunar eclipses are full moons. We're going to see that later on in advanced levels. There's actually a part in the program that you can run every single eclipse that ever happens in your entire lifetime for your birthday, and they all matter. What I'll invite you to look at is in your psychology, and you can ask your parents if they're living, that how did that impact either the pregnancy, the birth, their own psychology. That's what I would invite you to look at until we get to into the eclipses, because that you're going to learn to run all of the eclipses on solar fire, and you're going to see every eclipse. But an eclipse, the concept of the eclipse is that something must die, right? That something must be eclipsing so that some new version can be born. Because if you're being birthed and you're being asked to eclipse something, you're going to see a life, death, and a shadow light aspect. And it already speaks to that being a full moon. So you're going to see that repeated in your chart. And we've talked about that. So that's going to be a thematic. It's just another layer to the story. So let's see what phase. So Abby's in a gibbous. So you're in the phase right before a full moon. So it's interesting because we saw that earlier, that you have all these things on the cusp, and now you're about to get to a full moon. So it's always like about to get there, or about to be on the edge, or about to reach it, or about to grab it. There's that thematic. But a gibbous is on the way to being full. So there's a lot of self-awareness. The older phases, especially past the full moon, the older phases have more of an introspective quality. The younger phases are more about personality and action and identity, whereas the further we get along in the phases, the more introspection or a sense of identity and self we find in the personality. And Jen. Ooh, Jen, you're balsamic. I didn't know that. Okay, so the balsamic moon is the last moon. It's the last phase of the moons. So this is a winding down lifetime. But the key thing with a balsamic moon is that their wisdom, it's a wisdom moon. The wisdom has to be passed on to somebody. So what you consider to be perhaps your wisdom, your intelligence, or your soul's intelligence, part of your goal in this lifetime is to pass it on to someone, to leave it behind. So it's not uncommon that people with balsamic moons are teachers or wisdom keepers, because they're passing on the information to the next set of whoever follows. So that's a great moon. Now, something, and I know this about your youth, balsamic moons tend to be very much encounter with death. So remember that whole trajectory of deaths that you had when you were younger. That's not uncommon because it's an ending moon. There's a lot of endings. Now, in your particular chart, you're on the cusp of the 12th. So it's the ending house. So a lot of this is about endings, and you're here to just finish things. And so one of the ways we finish is through death. But endings are an inevitable part of the balsamic moon's lifetime. My daughter has that as well. Let's look at Nicole. Disseminating. Okay, so this is post full moon. At this point, we're starting to see a winding down. So at the full moon, you start to realize that you have to find a source of light on your own in this lifetime. People that are post full moon, like disseminating, the balsamic, they're about winding down. They're more about introspection. They're more about giving back. They're more about teaching, giving what they've learned, passing that on. Specifically the balsamic, because you're done with sort of the life cycle of the 8 lifetimes. But anything post full moon is similar. Any questions about sign, house, psychology of the moon, how it behaves? So remember, this is the matrix in which everybody is viewing their life. Nobody is looking at any other planets. They're seeing their moon sign and house. That's how they see the world forever. That is something that never goes away. We obviously evolve, we grow, we learn, but that's at the core, that subconscious function is I need a safe space, our womb, our home. We want food, we want breath. Food is protection, breath is validation, the womb is safety, security. Love is on our own, is our own responsibility, but we move through the phases of the moon, whatever we have to do in order to get the love. So you see all the unmet needs in that, the importance of the planet by, or the luminary by sign and by house, and why it's so important. It's a mind game. Questions? Jen, do you have a question? You look.
Francis, can you just look at Sharon's really quick so I can tell her to watch the end of the class? And she'll
yes, of course. So Sharon's is also in Sag. So again, the fire moons and the air moons are the most disseminating, dispersed moons, the hardest to grasp. The fire moons specifically are the least deep moons. This does not mean that you're not a person with depth. That is not what that means. It's just, and again, we're just piecemealing a tiny little piece of the whole story, okay? That's why I don't like to make those statements, but for educational purposes, we have to kind of give nuggets. So the moon in Sag, or all the fire moons, because it's fast and furious, it's fire, right? It comes, it's put out, and it's on to the next thing. They tend to avoid the depth. Again, Sharon has a lot of Pisces, so there's going to be depth in other ways. It's in the first house, and this, I said, has to do with changing the face to whatever the crowd is doing or what the person is requiring of you. So that's an important thing to watch. Now, it's also on the cusp, so it might be an importance of using money emotionally, or making emotional purchases, value associated with your emotions, or your emotions has to do with a big part of your value system. So there's that overlap between the first and the second house. And then as a phase, the third quarter. Okay, so this is after the full moon. And again, it's winding down right before the balsamic. It's right as you're winding down. So what happens with these later lifetimes of the 8 is that as you're winding down, a lot of times what the soul does, if the soul's saying, okay, this is my 7th, for instance, here, of 8 lifetimes, I better hurry up and get the lesson. I better hurry up and understand what the soul came to learn. So you might see like an upswing on spiritual development or psychological development or seeking, and it's a moon in Sag, it's a seeking moon. And so it might kick into high gear because the soul is saying, oh, I only have one lifetime until I put this lesson to rest and I reset. So that's something that you often see with like a third quarter. I go much more into depth in that Shadow Side of the Mother's Love book with all of these things, but you've got a lot of content in your materials and your video as well. Any other questions? Okay, great. Then next week, we're doing the sun, right? Yeah, we'll do the sun, and we'll do sun through the houses and the signs as another luminary. And so if your focal point is always your emotions, then there's a lack of emotional intelligence. You're constantly being driven by the emotions. And let me specify, emotion and no emotion. So excess emotion or no emotion, same thing. You're not healthier because you don't demonstrate emotion, okay? So whether your emotions are all over the place or you are so contained and reserved in your emotion and don't show them, that neither extreme is good. It's the same side of the coin. So the moon can be an either or. So the moon in Capricorn, for instance, it's very cold, very reserved, perhaps very moderated in terms of how much emotion they show, doesn't mean that they're more emotionally intelligent. And the emotions, when they're not fully processed into what I call feelings, and we don't feel the feelings, end up creating energetic blockages linked to the body part that rules your moon sign. So hence my breast cancer. There's nowhere else that I would have that, but it went straight to the breast. And by the way, cancer is also breast and stomach. It's both. So when we let the moon rule our life, then there isn't room for individuation, because here we are honoring mom and dad and what they taught us and what they want us to be, and that's our unlived life. When we finally start living out through the sun, we birth ourselves through our sun, like the myth, that's a whole different story. We have an emotional connection to our family. We cannot erase our low-level consciousness. We're born into that manger, into that mass consciousness, but we move through our life from the lens of the sun. That'll be next week. It's a completely different psychology when you're living solar versus lunar. And an emotional intelligence is developed with that knowledge, because the emotions don't run the show. Emotions are linked to the water element, and water puts out your fire, which is your self-worth, which is your sun. So we'll talk more about that next week. Okay, anything else? Okay. Have a good week, you guys.
You staying on for me?
I'm gonna log off and then I'll meet you on after. Wait, Abby has a question?
I have a question. It's not super relevant. I was just gonna ask if you guys had time, could you send me the colors? Like what I talked about before.
Oh, the colors.
Yeah, just like the colors.
Oh, for the
and, like,
deck?
the
I'm just gonna
logo,
separate.